You are a meathead.
Perception is reality. Perspective shapes the world around you. I'm JJ Weinberg, and this is my perspective. Greetings and salutations. My name is JJ Weinberg. I am an artist, an activist, an alchemist, an author, and I am none of these things. Always say that at the beginning to remind us that the frames and the labels we give ourselves can actually be a hindrance on our growth. This, if you're listening to this episode now on December 17th, 2025, it's a Wednesday episode at 6 p.m. And normally this is a rerun spot, but I felt just too compelled. And thankfully, Greg said, it's cool if I got this episode ready to just slide in to my normal rerun spot because I wanted to talk about something that's just too timely to wait. So before I get into this episode, I want to thank Voga Barnes and Denny for underwriting this program. I would not be here on WVLP on Saturdays at noon or on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. if it weren't for you guys. Also, if you miss any of these episodes, you can find them on my website, jjweinberg.com/perspective, or if you just want to go back to a past episode. So buckle up. Here we go. I don't want them living next door to me. I don't hate them. I just don't want them near me. This country was better when everyone knew their place. You give people rights, the next thing you know, they want more. I'm not prejudiced. I just think people should stay with their own kind. What's wrong with being proud of who we are and suspicious of everybody else? Does that sound familiar? Did somebody pop into your mind just now, somebody that you might know? Does it sound like maybe it was a rally of some sort or a cable news clip? Maybe a Twitter thread? Let me give you the answer. Those words came from Archie Bunker, a fictional character from All in the Family, early 1970s America. So here's the real question. Why do those words sound so current? Why do they sound like something that you heard this week? So we start with this thing that might make people feel uncomfortable. And no quotes, no names, no context, just the words. And if we listen closely, again, it sounds way too similar. It sounds way too familiar. It sounds like an echo. It's like looking into a dirty mirror. So Archie Bunker wasn't written to be admired. He was written to be exposed. He was a mirror. A funhouse mirror, but still a mirror. Norman Lear didn't create Archie so America could agree with him. He created Archie so that America could see itself. Archie was meant to be the punchline. But something strange happened. Somewhere along the way, the punchline became the platform. And that leads me to the question that I want to sit with today. How did a generation raised to laugh at Archie Bunker grow up to become him? How did we go from Meatheads to Archie Bunker? I know there are people who were long hairs, who were hippies, who were right there with Michael. And now, all of a sudden, they've become Archies. So how did that generation that marched, protested, burned bras, opposed the war, demanded civil rights, suddenly sink in to that comfortable chair? Not a throne, a chair, a soft one, the kind they don't want to get up from. The kind where fear feels like wisdom. Mark Twain once said that it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. And that chair, my friends, is where the fooling happened. So let's look at Meathead, Michael Stivic, the character conservatives love to mock, the so-called naive liberal, the bleeding heart liberal, as Archie would call him, the idealist, the guy who asks annoying questions like, if there's a God, Archie, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why does equality feel like a threat to you? What happens if you're wrong? Meathead wasn't perfect. In fact, I saw an interview with Rob Reiner where he was saying that among all of his more liberal-leaning perspectives, he still had that male chauvinism in him. He wasn't a friend of the feminist movement. And Meathead was preachy, he was clumsy, he was sometimes insufferable. But he was asking some pretty important questions, and he was asking sometimes the right questions. Questions rooted in empathy, questions rooted in justice, questions rooted in the idea that the world could be better than it was handed to us. And that was the spirit of the generation. That was the hippie bra-burning movement. That was the long hairs. You know, that was the same generation that saw police dogs in Birmingham, fire hoses on men, women, and children, state violence in Selma. Fred Hampton murdered in his bed by the Chicago Police Department and the FBI. And if you don't know anything about Fred Hampton, look and see why he was murdered. He was bringing together people, poor whites, Hispanics, blacks, all under a mission, the Rainbow Coalition. Look up Fred Hampton. But this generation, they saw Vietnam. They saw Watergate. They saw, I'm not a crook. They saw the lies. They saw the corporate power. They saw politicians and wealthy people dodge wars that they sent other people's children to fight. So how did that generation become the one saying, just comply, stop complaining, know your place. If you don't like our country, then leave. How many times have we heard it? From bringing up contradictions, from bringing up the notion that we can grow, that we can get better. So how? How did they go from Meathead to Archie? Some people took that journey. My theory, nobody becomes Archie Bunker overnight. Not even Archie became Archie Bunker overnight. You sink into him. You get tired. You get comfortable. You stop listening to different perspectives. That's why we're here. And again, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about on this show thus far has been very bird's eye. It's been pulled back. We haven't got into a lot of socio-political issues yet. We've touched on it, danced around it, and I've mentioned that I knew it would come up at some point in time, and this is just one of those times I feel like I want to throw some perspective on what happened with Rob Reiner, because that question hit me so clearly. I'm like, I know people that were very much like Meathead. They were in that position, and now they sound like Archie. And even if they were never Meathead, they still knew how to laugh at Archie. They knew to laugh at his folly. But now they sound like him. And it's so strange to me. So, they start to mistake maybe stability for righteousness. this notion again of the fear of the other, this tribalism, the fear of the immigrant. I mean, again, it's so silly that people would be so up in arms about thinking that someone's going to take their jobs and not be concerned about artificial intelligence, which is going to wipe out almost all jobs. That's one thing that we should definitely look at through the lens of what does it mean as money filters to the top 0.001% of the population. So slowly, maybe very slowly, fear replaces curiosity. The chair becomes familiar. The springs sag. Like when we were young, we have that spring in our step. We have that spring in our mind. And slowly, they start to sag. And suddenly, a little bit of bigotry doesn't feel like hatred, maybe. It feels like common sense. If I go back to Khalil Gibran for a minute, he says, your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. That's from his book, The Prophet, where he's talking about joy and pain. And in that, he's saying, like, sometimes we have to suffer to grow. And there's the notion that Rumi, and we've talked about this many times before here, love is not a subtle argument. The door there is devastation. That's the same pain, the same breaking of the shell. And that we're talking about anything from losing a loved one to, losing your job, whatever it might be. But here, to think about it now, it's like, what happens if we refuse the breaking of the shell that might have formed around our dreams being squandered, our dreams calcifying and turning into a shield around our hearts because we gave up and we lost our youth and we started to lose perspective? What happens when we protect that shell at all costs and we harden? And hardened hearts don't hear. That's one thing that always fascinates me. So I am a reader, but you don't have to read. Like if you read, you can get out of your state, both your state that you live in and your state of mind, and go somewhere else. But you don't have to read. You can watch films, documentaries. Okay, maybe documentaries are too boring for you. There are biopics that you can watch. You can watch 42, the Jackie Robinson story. You can watch Run, the Jesse Owens story. You can watch Good Lord Bird about John Brown. I mean, it's a fantastic miniseries. Ethan Hawke, I've got a whole episode coming up about talking around some things and some ideas. Ethan Hawke will come into that episode for sure, talking about seeing life as a film. But there are all of these different kinds of films that you can watch, places to go if you don't have a hardened heart. I've talked about American History X before through a number of my articles and writings and essays, and some of you have not watched American History X, and it shows. It shows. We have to break that shell. Your pain is the breaking of a shell that encloses your understanding. So, when we have, whether it's family members, friends, loved ones that have that hardened shell, we have to be up to the task to say, hey, we need to try and crack this thing open a little bit. Now, you can't come in like, again, Meathead with the folly, but you better be ready to kind of chisel away at some of that hardness. So that would bring me now to, most recently, Rob Reiner, of course, we know now, was murdered, and his wife They were murdered by their son. And the notion of that happening in any family is devastating. And while we don't really know enough, we wouldn't know the situation in the family. We don't have access to that long story of what might have been happening, either just in Nick's personal life or his psychology or what had him that broken or what the infighting was in the family, if any. We don't know that. What we do know is that it wasn't a political assassination. And that brings us, of course, to Donald Trump, the Archie Bunker in the White House. I mean, if you can't see a lot of the things that Donald Trump says as very Archie Bunker-like, at the very least, you would know that many of his supporters sound like Archie Bunker. And, you know, when we look at things like, I look at other films like V for Vendetta or The Matrix or something like George Orwell's 1984 and Big Brother, it's really weird that people seem to confuse what these authors and screenwriters and directors were aiming at. So, I mean, just take Orwell, for example. When he talks about doublespeak, he talks about the ministry of truth. And the post that we're going to talk about today from Donald Trump was posted on a platform that he calls Truth Social. It's almost like we're not even being creative. We're just going to go ahead and pull out of the dystopian fiction and make it our reality. I really can't even process it, to be honest with you. But recently, we now know that Trump dismissed, I guess you could say that, Rob Reiner, dismissed is lightly to say it, a man whose entire career, Rob Reiner's entire career, has explored empathy, justice, and moral reckoning. And he dismisses him by sneering about Trump derangement syndrome after he was murdered. He and his wife were murdered, and Trump calls it Trump derangement syndrome. So it's not an argument, not a disagreement. It's not politics. It's literally playground cruelty with a microphone. And this is why it matters. It's not just that Trump is nasty. It's that nastiness is the point. Nastiness has become a feature. It goes right back to Archie. Archie was meant to be laughed at. His nastiness was meant to be skewered. But in Trump, it's not a flaw. And people are sinking into that soft chair that he has. I mean, Archie Bunker said awful things, but the audience laughed at him, like at him, not with him. Trump is saying awful things, and people are laughing with him. And that's the shift. So I'm going to read directly. If you haven't heard it yet, I'm sure you probably have. I'm going to read some of Trump's direct quotation from his post. A very sad thing happened last night in Hollywood. Rob Reiner, a tortured and struggling, but once very talented movie director and comedy star, has passed away, together with his wife, Michelle. Look, I can't even do this without adding commentary. A tortured and struggling Rob Reiner. I've never seen a single thing that makes me feel like Rob Reiner was tortured and struggling. Not once. He's primarily using satire and comedy, so at the very least, he's laughing at anything like struggling. But just to call him a tortured and struggling person is obscene. And then just, starts with passed away. He didn't pass away. He was murdered, right? So together with his wife. And here we go. I'll just keep going. Reportedly, due to the anger he caused others through his massive, unyielding, and incurable affliction with a mind-crippling disease known as Trump derangement syndrome, sometimes referred to as TDS. I mean, please, we've got to come to something that sounds like rational right now. I don't even know if Archie Bunker would be capable of this one, right? I mean, the massive, unyielding, and incurable affliction with the mind. I mean, wow. Trump derangement syndrome. There is a Trump derangement, but it might be that Trump is deranged. And then, of course, the Trump derangement syndrome is in all caps. Trump loves to know how to use the caps right on his social posts. Again, and he's a president who is posting on a social media platform that he supposedly created. It's just kind of crazy. But anyway, he was known to have driven people crazy, all caps, again, crazy, by his raging obsession of President Donald J. Trump. With his obvious paranoia reaching new heights as the Trump administration surpassed all goals and expectations of greatness, and with the golden age of America upon us, perhaps like never before, may Rob and Michelle rest in peace. Wow. I mean, how do you even articulate the obscenity of that? And I know by the time you're hearing this, you've probably already went through this on every news channel and comedy show and everything else. But I just want to bring it to the notion of Archie Bunker, because we have to understand that on the other side of the perspective, there are a bunch of Archie Bunkers sinking in to their sofas, into their favorite chairs with those worn springs, and they're toasting this. They're toasting it with a bottle of beer and yelling at Edith about what's for dinner. So we hear this from the leader of the country, and it juxtaposes with the criticism that I heard around Charlie Kirk and people on the left when Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And what I want to get to is, you've probably heard already people talking about this as well. So I want to get to, what does the hypocrisy mean? How do we get someone to see the hypocrisy? Like, can I see the hypocrisy of myself and how I felt when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, and how Donald Trump is saying that Rob Reiner had Trump derangement syndrome because it's just someone who was against him? I mean, I want to be careful here, because we should never celebrate harm or excuse violence. But the irony is like, it feels like that's what Trump is doing. And I know that people on the right say that that's what they feel like people on the left were doing. So then let's talk about it. Let's talk about the similarities and the differences without just making excuses. I wrote an article about Charlie Kirk after he was assassinated. I'm going to read from some of it right now. But the first thing that I led with were Charlie's words. I didn't say anything about violence myself. I didn't say anything negative about Charlie. All I did was post a quote with his words that then linked to my article. And the point of what I was writing was that inside of it, I already know that people will get triggered just by looking at the words that I wrote on the post, even though they weren't mine. But then what does that lead us to? So let me go to that essay that I wrote after Charlie was assassinated here. I'll post a link to this if you want to read it all. It's a 6-minute read, so I'm going to just go ahead and read through the whole thing, and then we can talk about it afterwards and how everything works together. But the title of the piece is A Triggered Nation, Charlie Kirk Hijacked Christianity, and the Awful Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I start with the irony for me is this. I know how easily I could hijack people's fight or flight response. I know how to trigger. Kirk made a career of poking the bear for clicks. As I reflected on the abomination of his murder and his vile perspectives, I had to stop myself from the low-hanging fruit without first giving time and space for reflection in this writing. The second I found out, I thought about immediately posting one of Charlie Kirk's quotes without quotation marks and watching the vitriol and disdain for my perspective come in like a tidal wave. Attention, clicks, the algorithm of adrenaline hijacked. Charlie thrived on such interactions. Only it wouldn't be my perspective, they would be Charlie's own words. So I made a post like that after careful consideration. Perhaps that's why you're here reading this essay. Though I can only imagine that most who might have attacked it did so without reading what comes next. In doing so, they attack the mirror I'm holding up of Kirk's own words. I don't believe in empathy. And of course, some deaths are acceptable to preserve the Second Amendment. Kirk's supporters, or even moderates who are unaware, might curse me as cruel or rush to condemn this endeavor as callous. They demonize the so-called left, as Charlie did on a regular basis, without realizing that they were all screaming at Charlie Kirk himself. This is a classic case of psychological projection. I don't condone Kirk's murder. Making a martyr of a man who used the parasitism of the alligator brain into a hero is dangerous. Charlie, like many political opportunists, thrived on our tribal panic, inflaming fear and calling it truth. It was vampirism, plain and simple. It's something that Trump did in his announcement of Kirk's passing. He makes a claim to deride division, then in the next breath calls out the radical left lunatics. Imagine, I'm pausing here what I'm reading from this essay because he basically hadn't come up with TDS yet, Trump derangement syndrome. So he would have used it then if he had the brand. It was something he's probably been working on. So in the next breath, he calls out the radical left lunatics that Charlie Kirk often demonized in the same manner. In this sense, he and Donald Trump are cut from the same cloth. They're cut from the same cloth. That's the fabric on Archie Bunker's chair. That's what I'm talking about. That's the fabric. It's funny, I have on the article too, if you get a chance to check it out, the next section here is called When Fear is the Platform, and I have this image of Charlie Kirk with a Dr. King kneeling before him, and there's a crown on Dr. King's head, and it looks as though, is Charlie placing it on his head or is he taking it off his head? And the first image on the essay that's up a little bit further actually has Dr. King kind of kneeling again in front of Charlie Kirk, and Kirk has this sword where it might look like, is he knighting him or is the sword something more violent? So it's up to the viewer to decide what these things mean, right? But consider Kirk's own record. He said Martin Luther King Jr. was, quote unquote, not worthy of a national holiday, dismissing one of the clearest American apostles of Christian love and nonviolence as a mere DEI figure in history. He called King, quote, awful, claimed that he, quote, was not a good person, and even suggested that the Civil Rights Act was a mistake because it birthed what he caricaturized as a permanent DEI type bureaucracy. On another occasion, after the brutal hammer attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul, Kirk quipped, "Why hasn't he been bailed out? If some amazing patriot out there in San Francisco wants to be a midterm hero, someone should go bail this guy out." So Charlie is celebrating that violence on Nancy Pelosi's husband. And look, I'm going to tell you for clarity and perspective, I'm not a fan of party politics. I'm not a cheerleader for Nancy Pelosi by a long shot. But there has to be some consistency in what we're saying here about this violence. So strip away the tribal cheers, and what remains is a man making light of political violence and racial justice alike, while daring to cloak himself in the name of Christianity. So let us not sanitize the record. On Martin Luther King Jr., Charlie declared, "This guy is not worthy of a national holiday. He's not worthy of godlike status. In fact, I think it's really harmful." Those are Charlie's words. On the hammer attack against Paul Pelosi, he quipped, "Why hasn't he been bailed out? If some amazing patriot out there wants to be a midterm hero, someone should go bail this guy out." And then he laughs about it. On gun violence, he told America that some deaths were acceptable, like the cracked eggs of an omelet, so long as the Second Amendment remained untouched. And on empathy itself, he waved it away as a new age made-up word. It's something I didn't write here in this piece because I saw it afterward. But I literally watched Charlie Kirk talk about public executions and saying that we need to bring back public executions and laughing about it. Just snide with just this nasty tone. And then going so far as to say, at what point should children, I don't even said get to watch, but almost be made to watch these public executions? He's like, what, maybe like 11? Just absolutely disgusting. Does that mean that he should have been murdered? Absolutely not. Does that mean that we should have a national holiday because he was murdered? Absolutely not. So none of that, though, is an interpretation. Those are his words. Empathy is a fake New Age word. Gun deaths are expendable. Martin Luther King Jr. is unworthy of a national holiday and part of the problem. That was Charlie Kirk's doctrine. So the next section I have in this piece says the sword and the word Christianity without Christ. It has an image of a study for a painting that I'm going to do of Dr. King for my Well-Regulated Militia series. You can see that image on there as well if you go and check this article out. But here's where we must draw the sharpest contrast. Dr. King was not merely a political figure. He was a Christian preacher whose entire philosophy rested on nonviolence. He condemned it. Dr. King condemned violence, even in retaliation, which is uncommon. Dr. King's sword was his word. He proved that the pen is mightier. His power was nonviolence inspired by Christ, his faith, and the Sermon on the Mount. He embodied what Jesus told Peter in Gethsemane. Put your sword back in its place. Jesus says to Peter, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. We stand in Gethsemane. Do we cling to the sword like Charlie Kirk, daring to call it holy? Or do we put it down like Christ commanded, as Dr. King embodied? So to go back to this quote again, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our other God-given rights. That is a prudent deal. It is rational. Nobody talks like this. They live in a complete alternate universe. That's the full quote. Because I was, of course, being condemned for supposedly taking this out of context. Like as if you can somehow now take Donald Trump's quote on Rob Reiner out of context. Trump derangement syndrome. Charlie Kirk's word has always been his sword. He kept it sharp to cut, to divide, to prosper. What version of the Bible is he reading in which Jesus tells us something other than what is said in Matthew 26:52? Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. In what quote-unquote alternate universe did Charlie live? Where his call to arms was considered holy, while Dr. King's nonviolent movement and the Civil Rights Act were a mistake? That's not Christianity. That is an American heresy in political drag. If America is to survive its present vampire politics, we must learn again what Dr. King already knew and what Jesus already taught. The sword cannot save us. Only love, imagination, and empathy can. Only empathy, real, enduring, divine, has a chance. But Charlie Kirk once said, I can't stand the word empathy, actually. I think empathy is a made-up New Age term. It actually does a lot of damage. The next section is called the double standard of empathy. But this is the hypocrisy exposed. If empathy is false, why summon it now? If lives are expendable, why is his life suddenly sacred? If there is an objective truth, as Charlie so often preached, then this is it. The sword he refused to put down is the sword that cut him. If you agree with him then, you should agree with him now. If you believed his sermon that gun deaths are acceptable, then you must accept his own death as part of that grim arithmetic. If you followed his dismissal of empathy, then you cannot summon it now for him without making him the exception to the Second Amendment omelet. Who is Charlie talking about when he said that a number of deaths by gun violence is acceptable? I'll answer for you. He wasn't talking about any who. Charlie was looking at people as an abstraction, as numbers. It's what Charlie said, now Charlie's dead. He himself is a mere statistic in the abstraction. This is one of the myriad things I've personally rejected in Charlie Kirk's perspective. Deeply flawed, deeply inhumane. I don't feel the same about him. His murder is an absolute tragic consequence of living by the sword. Gun deaths are acceptable, empathy is meaningless, and violence is a necessary sacrifice. That's Charlie. And Dr. King, who epitomized the opposite stance, is a DEI Marxist too focused on race issues. These are the views to honor Charlie Kirk. Anything else would be a cleansing contradiction of his truth. The peril of martyrdom. Let me be plain. I do not celebrate Charlie Kirk's murder. This act of violence risks transforming a provocateur into a martyr. And martyrdom has the potential to cleanse a man's record. It risks bleaching away the misogyny, the racial diminishment, the complacency with gun violence, and replacing it with myth. A myth that he contended good Christians need to examine in their understanding of Dr. King. Charlie Kirk should not be remembered as a saint of political courage. He should be remembered as he was, a man who belittled empathy, mocked nonviolence, and dared to strip Dr. King of his crown. That is who Charlie was in his own words. That is his epitaph. So that's my writing on Charlie. It was I think it was, let me see what the date was that I posted this, September 11th, oddly enough, of 2025. Rob Reiner, going back to Meathead, going back to Rob's comedy, satire, it makes me think of Mark Twain's quote that patriotism is supporting your country all the time and your government when it deserves it. Archie Bunker confused the two. So do many today. Archie Bunker, no doubt, would have been sitting there watching Charlie Kirk's memorial, brushing away so much of the inconsistency and the hypocrisy, and cheering along with Donald Trump about Trump derangement syndrome. And let's not forget, Charlie Kirk was making the rounds to college campuses. And it brings up yet another correlation here. It's one more thread that we have to pull on, because it runs straight through Archie Bunker, Charlie Kirk, and right into Donald Trump, and straight through this moment that we're living in. Education. Archie Bunker hated the fact that Michael went to school. Just go back and look at the episodes. It was one of his favorite weapons in his tool belt. Every time Meathead opened his mouth, Archie didn't really ever argue the idea. He attacked the source. Oh, here we go again, Mr. College Boy. You think you know everything because you read a couple of books. And you have to love this one. They filled your head with that liberal garbage down at that school. Sound familiar? That was the 1970s. The 1970s. Nothing has changed. It's the same script, the same lines, the same fear. The moment someone starts learning how the systems work, power reacts. Because education does something dangerous. It teaches pattern recognition. It teaches history. It teaches people how to connect the dots. And once you can connect dots, you can unsee the picture. Again, we obliterate the frame. Your perspective can change. That's why Archie didn't hate Michael because he was young. He hated him because he was educated. Because education exposes the con. We can go back to Mark Twain again. Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect. And especially, again, if politics are a game for you, I don't care what color jersey you're wearing, but if you're wearing a jersey with a politician's name on it, you might need to pause and reflect. I don't care whose name it is or what color the jersey is. If you're taking politics into jersey wearing, time to pause, time to reflect. Education teaches you how to pause. And pausing is poison to propaganda. And this is where the Charlie Kirk playbook becomes obvious. They didn't just attack Dr. King's ideas. They painted a picture of Dr. King as a communist. Said he was radicalized by academics. He was poisoned by books. It wasn't accidental. It's the oldest trick in the book. If you can discredit learning, you don't have to debate the actual ideas. If you can make education suspicious, you can keep people pliable. You can keep people gullible. Because reading is so much more difficult. Learning, if you're not inspired to find out something new, if you aren't curious. We talk about Viktor Frankl here, and he says that a human being is a deciding being. And we say that, or he says that there's a space, there's a gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap is your power. Education is one of the ways that we can start to widen that gap. We can keep that gap large so we can make an educated decision. We can make a more empowered decision. And deciding is what keeps us human. So if we are closing that gap, if propaganda and lack of education and lack of empathy and lack of can keep closing that gap between stimulus and response, and we're knee-jerk pointing at the TV Archie Bunker in our favorite chair, then it's easier to manipulate us, to make those decisions for us. And it's so funny to see people with the lion and the sheep memes and t-shirts. I just saw one this afternoon. That's what made me think of it. I'm a lion, not a sheep. Are you? The same thing happened to Malcolm X. The same thing happened to Frederick Douglass. Why do you think that it was illegal to have slaves reading? It was illegal to teach an enslaved man to read. Frederick Douglass taught himself. Frederick Douglass told us that it is easier to build strong children than repair broken men. But the same thing happened to Jane Addams. The same thing happened to every movement that threatened corporate power. They'll say you're un-American. They'll say you've been brainwashed. They'll say you think you're smarter than everyone else. Finally, they say, stop teaching this. That's not new. That's systemic self-defense. And again, I just saw this. Donald Trump sending Head Start a list of 200 words to stop using to describe their programming. The list of words: accessible, activism. I say that at the beginning. Activist, I say that at the beginning of this show. I say at the beginning of every show. So I now have Trump derangement syndrome because I use the word activism or all-inclusive or anti-racist or biased. You ready for this one? Because it's a big one on college campuses. Confirmation bias. Cultural sensitivity. DEI. Disability. You can't say disability. Diverse. Disparity. Discrimination. Diversity. Equality. Environmental quality. I mean, female? You can't say female. You can't say hate speech. Hispanic minority. Identity. Injustice. Oppression. Political. Race. Racial diversity. Racial identity. Segregation. Racism. Stereotype. Undervalued. Underprivileged. Traumatic. These are words that are being said that you can't use by the administration in Head Start. And of course, if you're not familiar, Head Start is a free, federally funded program supporting school readiness for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers from low-income families, offering comprehensive early education, health, nutrition, family support. Of course, low-income families and education. It comes back full circle. This is the ruse. Them big books you reading. Come on, man. We see it laid bare. We see efforts, policies, guidance, just pushing back against the words themselves. That is Orwellian. Doublespeak. That is control. You want to talk about censorship? We're talking about words by themselves, not even ideas, not actions, not behaviors, words. Why would anyone be afraid of words unless those words unlock something? Why would anyone say that children shouldn't learn the language of empathy, why would anyone say kids shouldn't know the word racism? Unless the goal is ignorance, unless the goal is obedience, unless the goal is to keep the chair comfortable. Archie's chair. Gibran, a man said, "Speak to us of self-knowledge," and he answered, "Your hearts know in silence the secrets of the days and the nights." Education gives us language to what the heart already knows. That's the danger. Once you have language, silence stops working. So Archie was afraid of books. Archie Bunker didn't hate books because they were boring. He hated them because they threatened his certainty, because books introduce doubt, because doubt leads to humility, and humility collapses authoritarian power and your proximity to it by maybe like the color of your skin. So this is why authoritarian systems always burn books, ban books, mock books, defund schools, attack teachers, and ridicule students, not because education is wrong, but because it works. And here we have it. The same thing over and over. This is the irony. Patriot, the person who can holler the loudest without knowing what he's hollering about. That's Mark Twain. Also, Mark Twain reminds us that travel is fatal to prejudice. And as I said before, when we read, we can travel without moving. We can go to different states of mind, different places and frames of reference, and increase our understanding of someone else's life and their perspective. So ignorance wrapped in a flag is still ignorance. So when you hear someone mocking college kids, teachers, professors, library, history, or those elites with their books, just remember Archie Bunker. Remember that this isn't new. Remember the goal has always been the same. Keep you uncurious, keep you comfortable, keep you seated. Because an educated person doesn't stay in the chair, they stand up, they ask questions, they notice patterns. And once that happens, the system loses its grip. That's why this fight was never really about politics. It was about education. And it still is. That's why if you know anything about my Million Bob March and what I did with Bob Ross's legacy and talking about Fred Rogers was involved with making sure children were educated. And he was doing things in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s that were challenging people's lack of empathy. He was reminding us about getting in touch with our feelings. What he did with Officer Clemens on his show by soaking his feet in a pool in his backyard with a black man was not just confrontational. It was what they would now denigrate as being woke. And Bob Ross was reminding us of our imagination, of our creative spirit. So when we look at the defunding of public media, we see it all going hand in hand with this disparity, the twisted attempt to try and close that gap, that space that Viktor Frankl reminds us that we have between stimulus and response, because the leader of the country doesn't have it. Look how he responds to something like Rob Reiner's passing, his horrific murder by his son, and he comes on the national stage and says that he was murdered because he didn't like me. That's what Trump says between the lines. He was murdered because he doesn't like me. And then when someone pushes back and asks him later, do you still stand behind that statement? Like maybe the gap was closed and you said something foolish in a moment. No, he doubles down. He says, I never liked Rob Reiner. I didn't like him because he didn't like me. The question is, why didn't he like you? The question is, why was Charlie Kirk criticized? when Donald Trump is removing Dr. King from one of the approved days for free entrance to the national parks and replacing it with his birthday, you have to say, there's a reason that Rob Reiner has criticized you. There's a reason why people were criticizing Charlie Kirk. What is your criticism of Rob Reiner other than he just didn't like you? Of course, if his contention with you is that you're stripping away holidays from Dr. King and replacing yourself, just take that one innocuous example. That's something that I can't imagine anyone other than Archie Bunker would appreciate. So you have Meathead and Rob Reiner coming to Donald Trump as Archie Bunker, asking the question, challenging Archie every step of the way. So what did we lose? What did this generation lose? It wasn't intelligence. It must be courage. The courage to stay uncomfortable, the courage to change, the courage to listen, the courage to admit we might be wrong. The Meathead generation didn't lose its mind. It lost its nerve. And fear rushed in to fill the vacuum. Fear of immigrants, fear of progress, fear of being left behind, and fear, when left unchecked, always needs a villain. So perspective isn't about winning arguments. It's about remembering who we were when we were brave. It's about asking whether the chair we're sitting in is worth the soul we traded for it. We don't need more Archies. We need more Meatheads. More annoying questions, more uncomfortable truths, more compassion that refuses to be shouted down. And so, if this episode made you uneasy at some point, good. Growth usually does. There's no growth in comfort. So I'm JJ Weinberg. This is my perspective. And the question I leave you with is simple. What chair are you sitting in?
You are a meathead.
Perception is reality. Perspective shapes the world around you. I'm JJ Weinberg, and this is my perspective.